I arrived at the lake house under a gray sky, the weight of the clouds pressing down on the frozen lake and the surrounding woods. The air was sharp with the cold of early winter, and as I stepped out of the car, my breath formed small clouds in front of me before being carried off by the biting wind. The cabin stood before me, nestled on the edge of the lake like an old sentinel, weathered and worn from years of solitude. The house had once belonged to my grandfather, a man I barely knew. He died the previous winter, under circumstances that no one in the family had seemed eager to discuss. It had come as a surprise to me when I inherited the place, an isolated retreat far from the noise of the city, miles from the nearest town. I supposed it made sense, though. The family knew how much I craved solitude, how I needed a break from the chaos of my life and the creative blocks that had held me captive for months. The cabin was small, yet sturdy, with thick wooden beams and a roof that sloped low to the ground, as if trying to protect itself from the relentless winds off the lake. I hesitated on the front porch for a moment, taking in the view. The lake stretched out before me like a sheet of dark glass, completely frozen over, reflecting the brooding sky. Tall pines circled the property, their needles dusted with the first hint of snow. I turned the key in the lock and stepped inside, the door creaking in protest as it swung open. The air inside was stale, tinged with the scent of old wood and dust. It had been months since anyone had been here, yet everything remained untouched, frozen in time, like the lake outside. The main room was simple, with a worn leather couch in front of a stone fireplace, and bookshelves lining the walls filled with yellowing paperbacks. A small kitchen sat to the side, its appliances old but functional. In the far corner, a narrow staircase led up to the loft, where I knew my bedroom awaited. I set my bags down by the door and wandered through the house, absorbing its quiet presence. The silence was thick, almost oppressive, but there was something peaceful about it. I had come here to write, to find inspiration in the solitude. But as I moved from room to room, a growing sense of unease began to settle in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't the cabin itself that bothered me. No, the place was warm and familiar, a remnant of simpler times. It was the lake. From every window, no matter where I stood in the house, I could see it, vast, still, and silent. It seemed to watch me as I moved about, the frozen surface glinting dully under the overcast sky. I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on my chest, and I found myself glancing toward it more often than I intended. I tried to shake off the feeling. I had come here for a reason, to escape the noise, the distractions, and the self-doubt that had plagued me for months. This cabin was supposed to be my refuge, a place where I could reconnect with my writing and, hopefully, with myself. I couldn't let a frozen lake get in the way of that. That evening, after a simple dinner, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames. I had brought my notebook with me, hoping to get some words down, but the pages remained blank. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the cracks in the window frames. I pulled a blanket tighter around my shoulders and leaned back in the old leather chair, letting the warmth of the fire soothe my tired body. It was then, as I sat in the flickering light, that I first heard it, a faint sound, barely audible over the wind. At first, I thought it was the trees creaking in the wind or the shifting ice on the lake, but as I listened more closely, I realized it was neither. It was a whisper. I froze, straining to hear over the wind, but the sound was gone as quickly as it had come. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, I was exhausted from the long drive, and the isolation of the place was already starting to wear on me. But as I lay in bed that night, the whisper lingered in my mind, creeping into the edges of my thoughts like a shadow. I couldn't shake the feeling that the lake was watching me, that something out there, beneath the ice, was trying to get my attention. The following morning greeted me with a heavy fog, thick and low, blanketing the lake and the trees like a shroud. The air felt even colder than the day before, and the landscape was eerily silent. No birds sang, no animals stirred, just the soft rustle of the wind through the pines and the faint groan of the frozen lake beneath the fog. I couldn't stop thinking about the whisper from the previous night. It had been so faint, almost easy to dismiss, but it lingered in the back of my mind like an unresolved melody. I tried to shake off the unease by burying myself in chores, unpacking my things and cleaning the dust from the cabin. But no matter what I did, the lake was always there, an ever-present, silent observer. By mid-afternoon, I was pacing the cabin, restless. My notebook lay open on the table, still untouched. The blank page stared back at me, mocking my inability to produce even a single sentence. I had come here for inspiration, but so far, all I had found was an unsettling stillness that gnawed at my nerves. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, looking out over the lake. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing patches of the frozen surface beneath. The ice was thick, crisscrossed with jagged lines that spider-webbed out from the center like the veins of some massive creature. The more I stared at it, the more it seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if something beneath the surface was shifting, stirring. And then I heard it again, a whisper, soft and distant, drifting up from the lake. I set my coffee down, heart racing, and leaned closer to the window. The sound was faint, almost like the murmur of wind through the trees, but there was something deliberate about it, something human. I could make out the cadence of speech, though the words themselves were unintelligible. I stood abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. I wasn't imagining this. Something was out there. I grabbed my coat and stepped outside, the cold biting into my skin as I made my way toward the lake. The air was still, unnervingly so, and the snow crunched under my boots with each step. As I approached the edge of the lake, the whisper faded into silence, replaced by the oppressive quiet of the frozen landscape. I stood there for a long moment, staring out over the ice, waiting for the sound to return. But there was nothing, just the faint whistle of the wind and the distant creak of the trees. I took a deep breath, my breath hanging in the air in front of me like a ghost, and forced myself to turn back toward the cabin. I was starting to feel foolish. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me. Maybe I had been alone for too long, and my mind was playing tricks on me. I hadn't seen another person in days, and the quiet was beginning to wear on me in ways I hadn't anticipated. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just my imagination. The whispers were real. Something out there was trying to communicate with me, and the more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that the lake was at the center of it all. That night, I sat by the fire again, trying to focus on my writing, but my mind kept drifting back to the whispers. I stared into the flames, the warmth of the fire doing little to ease the chill that had settled into my bones. Every so often, I would glance out the window, half expecting to see a figure standing on the ice, watching me from across the lake. And then, just as I was beginning to think I had imagined it all, I heard the whisper again. This time, it was louder, clearer, like someone speaking just outside the window. I shot up from my chair, heart pounding in my chest, and hurried to the window. My breath fogged the glass as I pressed my face against it, scanning the dark landscape beyond. There was nothing, just the empty lake and the dark silhouettes of the trees in the distance. But the whisper persisted, curling around the edges of my mind like smoke. I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the door, my pulse racing. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to know what was out there. I stepped outside, the cold air wrapping around me like a vice, and made my way toward the lake once again. The whisper grew louder as I approached the shore, until it seemed to surround me, echoing off the trees and the ice like a disembodied voice. I stood at the edge of the frozen water, the beam of my flashlight sweeping across the jagged surface. The whisper was louder now, almost insistent, but I still couldn't make out the words. It was as if the voice was speaking in a language I didn't understand, yet the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate. My hand shook as I aimed the flashlight at the center of the lake, where the cracks in the ice were deepest. And for just a moment, I thought I saw something, a dark shape, shifting beneath the surface. But when I blinked, it was gone. I didn't sleep much that night. The whispers had burrowed into my mind, playing over and over again as I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the lake, its frozen surface cracked and jagged, with something dark and shifting beneath the ice. By morning, the fog had thickened again, obscuring the trees and the lake in a gray, impenetrable mist. The air felt heavier, as though the world itself had grown denser, weighed down by whatever lingered beneath the surface of that frozen water. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me, waiting. I spent most of the day trying to distract myself, but no matter what I did, I found my eyes drifting toward the lake. The whispers hadn't returned, but their absence felt more unsettling than comforting. It was as if the silence was biding its time, waiting for the right moment to strike again. By late afternoon, the fog had begun to lift, and I found myself standing by the window once more, staring out at the lake. The ice shimmered dully in the fading light, its surface crisscrossed with deep cracks and fissures that seemed to pulse with some hidden energy. My gaze traveled across the jagged lines, tracing their patterns until I saw it again. A dark shape, barely visible beneath the ice, moving slowly in the depths. My heart skipped a beat. I leaned closer to the window, squinting, trying to make out the details, but the shape was too far below the surface. It was like looking through frosted glass, blurred and distorted, yet unmistakably there. I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin any longer. I had to get closer, had to see what was lying beneath the ice. Grabbing my coat and boots, I hurried outside, the cold air hitting me like a wall as I made my way toward the lake. My breath came in short bursts, fogging in front of me as I trudged through the snow. The closer I got to the lake, the heavier the air seemed to become, as if some unseen force was pressing down on me, making it harder to breathe. I could hear the faint creaking of the ice beneath my feet, and my heart raced with each step. I couldn't tell if the sound was real or just my imagination, but it filled me with a growing sense of dread. I reached the edge of the lake and stood there for a moment, staring out at the cracked surface. The dark shape was still there, barely visible beneath the ice, and I felt a strange pull, an almost magnetic force drawing me closer. My body moved on instinct, stepping onto the ice without hesitation. The surface creaked under my weight, but I didn't stop. I had to see. I had to know what was down there. I took another step, and then another, each one sending a tremor through the ice that echoed up through my legs. The cracks beneath my feet seemed to spread wider with every movement, spider webbing out in all directions, but I kept going. The dark shape grew clearer the closer I got, still blurred and indistinct, but now undeniably human. I stopped a few feet from the center of the lake, where the ice was the thinnest, and knelt down, pressing my hands against the cold surface. The whispers had returned, faint and distant, barely audible over the sound of my own breathing, but I could hear them, soft, insistent, calling my name. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the ice in front of me. The shape beneath the surface was clearer now, and I could see the outline of a face. A man's face, eyes closed, frozen in the depths. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his dark hair floated around his head like seaweed caught in a current. My stomach churned as I realized what I was looking at. This wasn't some forgotten relic buried in the lake. This was a body, perfectly preserved beneath the ice. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and the whispers grew louder, more urgent. I could feel the ice shifting beneath me, creaking and groaning as though it was alive, trying to pull me down into its depths. I scrambled to my feet, slipping on the slick surface as I turned to run back to shore. The whispers followed me, echoing in my mind, growing louder and more desperate with every step. I didn't dare look back. I could feel the eyes of the frozen man on me, watching, waiting. When I finally reached the shore, I collapsed into the snow, gasping for breath. My hands were shaking, my mind reeling from what I had seen. The lake was silent again, the whispers gone, but the image of the frozen man's face was burned into my memory. I sat there for a long time, staring out at the ice, trying to make sense of it all. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that the lake had more secrets to reveal, and the worst was yet to come. The morning after my discovery beneath the ice, I woke with a pounding headache and a deep sense of unease. I tried to tell myself that what I had seen wasn't real, that it was some trick of the light, or perhaps a result of my restless nights and the isolation playing tricks on my mind. But the memory of the frozen man's face beneath the ice was too vivid, too clear to be dismissed. I knew I couldn't stay alone with my thoughts any longer. I needed answers, anything that could explain what was happening on the lake. My grandfather had lived here for years. Surely, someone in town must have known him well enough to help me understand this place. Maybe they could explain the whispers, the body, and the strange atmosphere that seemed to hang over the lake like a curse. With renewed purpose, I drove into the small town a few miles away. It was a quiet place, a cluster of old brick buildings nestled at the foot of the mountains. The streets were mostly empty, and as I passed the few shops and diners, I noticed the tired faces of the townspeople. People who seemed like they'd lived here all their lives, weighed down by the years of hard winters and harder times. I stopped at the small general store, figuring it was as good a place as any to start. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside, and the man behind the counter, a grizzled, weathered figure with a shock of white hair and deep-set eyes, looked up from his newspaper. "What can I do for you?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to broach the subject. "I'm staying up at the old lake house," I finally said. "It used to belong to my grandfather. I'm just trying to learn more about the area." The man's expression darkened at the mention of the lake. He folded his newspaper and stood, coming around the counter to face me. "Your grandfather, you say?" he asked, his tone wary. "Yeah," I replied, growing more uneasy under his scrutiny. "John Michaels." The old man narrowed his eyes at me. "You're John Michaels' grandson, are you? Thought you looked a bit familiar." He fell silent for a moment, studying me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Finally, he spoke again. "You'd be wanting to talk to Harris, then." "Old man Harris. He was your granddad's closest friend, if you could call it that. Lives just a ways down the road from the lake. But I'll warn you, Harris isn't too keen on visitors these days. He's seen things up at that lake, things that turned him a bit strange." I felt a chill creep down my spine at his words, but I thanked him and made my way out of the store, determined to find this old man Harris. If anyone could shed light on what was happening at the lake, it had to be him. I found his house after a short drive. A small, dilapidated shack that looked like it had been cobbled together over the years from scraps of wood and metal. The roof sagged in places, and the windows were dark, but smoke curled lazily from the chimney, indicating that someone was home. I knocked on the door, the sound echoing hollowly in the cold air. For a moment, I thought no one would answer, but then I heard the shuffle of footsteps inside. The door creaked open, revealing a hunched old man with wild gray hair and eyes that seemed too sharp for someone of his age. "Harris?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. The old man squinted at me, then nodded. "That's me. And who might you be?" "I'm John Michaels' grandson," I said, and Harris's eyes widened slightly in recognition. He stepped back, gesturing for me to come inside. The inside of the house was just as dilapidated as the outside, cluttered with old furniture, stacks of newspapers, and dusty trinkets. Harris led me to a worn armchair by the fire and sat down across from me, his gaze never leaving my face. "So," he said after a long pause, "you've seen it, haven't you? The thing under the ice." I froze at his words, the weight of his question settling over me like a lead blanket. How could he have known? I hadn't told anyone. I think so," I managed to say. "What is it?" Harris leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "That, my boy, is a story your granddad took to his grave, and if you're smart, you'll let it stay buried." Harris's words hung in the air between us like the thick smoke from the fire. I wanted to press him for more details, but something in his eyes warned me to tread carefully. He leaned back in his chair, watching me with an unreadable expression, as if gauging whether I was ready to hear the truth. "You want answers," Harris said after a long silence, his voice gravelly and tired. "But sometimes, boy, answers ain't what you're looking for. Sometimes it's better to leave things in the dark, where they belong." I shifted uncomfortably in my chair. "I've already seen the thing beneath the ice," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I've heard the whispers. I need to know what's happening at the lake." Harris sighed heavily, rubbing his hands together as though trying to warm them, though the fire burned hot beside him. "Your granddad," he began. "He wasn't a bad man, but he got mixed up in something he couldn't control. He thought he could fix it, thought he could end it, but the lake, well, it has a way of keeping things." My pulse quickened as he spoke, a chill settling in my bones despite the warmth of the room. "What do you mean?" Harris stared into the fire, as though he could see something in the flames that I couldn't. "Your granddad and we tried to stop it. The whispers, the things beneath the ice, they've been there long before your granddad came to the lake. He got it into his head that he could perform some kind of ritual to bind the spirit, to keep it quiet. But something went wrong. The spirit wasn't bound. It was trapped, angrier than ever, and now it won't rest." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. What was the ritual? Harris's eyes flicked to mine, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I saw a flash of something resembling fear. The ritual was supposed to calm the spirit, to offer it peace. But it demanded a sacrifice. My heart skipped a beat. "A sacrifice?" "A life," Harris said simply. "That's the way of these things. Blood for blood, they say. But your granddad wasn't willing to go that far. He tried to outsmart it, tried to fool the spirit with a token offering. It didn't work. The spirit wasn't satisfied." I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. "And now? It's still waiting?" Harris nodded gravely. "It's waiting, and it's not going to stop until it gets what it wants." I stood up abruptly, pacing the small room. The thought of my grandfather, stubborn, proud, always trying to find a way around a problem, attempting to trick some ancient force, was both terrifying and unsurprising. But now I was caught in the aftermath of his failure. "I need to finish the ritual," I said, more to myself than to Harris. "If I don't, this thing will keep haunting the lake, and me along with it." Harris looked up at me with a weary expression. "You'd be playing a dangerous game, boy. You think you can control it? I've seen men far stronger than you try and fail. You'd best think twice before you go digging up the past." But I was resolute. I couldn't live with the constant whispers, the feeling of being watched, the knowledge that something dark and ancient was lurking beneath the ice, waiting for its moment. I had to finish what my grandfather had started, no matter the cost. I turned to leave, but Harris called after me, his voice thick with warning. "Listen to me, boy. If you go through with this, there's no coming back. The lake, it remembers. It knows what you're trying to do." I paused at the door, looking back at the old man. His face was etched with worry, but there was something else there, too. A hint of regret, or perhaps guilt. "You were a part of this, too," I said quietly. Harris nodded, the weight of his past heavy on his shoulders. And I've paid the price for it every day since. Don't make the same mistake your granddad did. Some things aren't meant to be fixed." I left the shack, Harris's warnings echoing in my mind. But I couldn't turn back now. The lake had already claimed too much of me, and if I didn't finish this, it would claim more. The drive back to the lake house was tense, my mind swirling with the weight of Harris's words. The afternoon sky had turned gray, thick clouds rolling in as a light snow began to fall, coating the trees and the frozen lake in a white blanket. But even as the snow fell softly around me, I couldn't shake the feeling of something lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to break free. When I arrived at the cabin, the stillness of the place felt oppressive, as though the very air had thickened with the presence of something unseen. I stepped out of the car and stood for a moment, staring at the lake. The cracks in the ice seemed wider now, more jagged, as if the lake itself was straining to contain whatever lay beneath. The whispers hadn't returned, but I could feel them, waiting in the silence, biding their time. I couldn't waste any more time. I had to act. Inside the cabin, I pulled out my grandfather's journals and began sifting through the old, yellowed pages. His handwriting was neat and precise, yet the deeper I read into the journals, the more erratic his entries became. Frantic scrawls about the whispers, the shadows he saw beneath the ice, and the ritual he believed would calm the restless spirit. The instructions were vague, incomplete in places, but I had enough to go on. The ritual required certain items: a flame, a personal token tied to the spirit, and an offering, something that could satisfy its thirst for life. My hands shook as I gathered what I needed: candles, a match, a silver locket that had belonged to my grandfather, and a small knife. I knew what I had to do. Blood for blood, Harris had said. But I wasn't ready to go that far, at least not yet. I hoped the offering of the locket, combined with the ritual, would be enough to appease the spirit without demanding the ultimate price. As I stepped back outside, the snow had intensified, falling in thick flakes that swirled around me as I made my way down to the lake. The wind howled through the trees, and the ice groaned beneath the weight of the snow. The lake was a vast, white expanse, broken only by the deep cracks in the ice that stretched out like spiderwebs. I knelt at the edge of the lake, close to the largest crack, where I had seen the dark shape beneath the ice. My breath came in ragged bursts as I lit the candles, placing them carefully around the locket in a small circle. The flames flickered in the wind, casting long shadows across the ice. The whispers began again, soft at first, like the rustling of leaves, but growing louder with each passing second. My heart pounded in my chest as I took the knife and drew it across my palm, wincing as the blade bit into my skin. Blood welled up in my hand, dripping onto the ice. The wind seemed to howl louder in response, and the whispers rose to a fever pitch, surrounding me, echoing in my mind. I held the locket in my bloodied hand, raising it toward the center of the lake. "I offer this in peace," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Please, let this be enough." For a moment, everything went still. The wind died down, the whispers faded into silence, and the only sound was the soft crackle of the candle flames. I held my breath, waiting, and then, with a loud, resounding crack, the ice beneath me shifted. I stumbled back, my heart leaping into my throat as I watched the ice splinter and break apart in jagged lines, radiating out from the center of the lake. The dark shape beneath the ice began to move, rising slowly toward the surface. My stomach churned as the whispers returned, louder and more desperate than before. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping so rapidly that my breath froze in front of me, hanging in the air like a ghostly cloud. I could see it now, clearly, as though the ice had become transparent. The figure beneath the ice was moving, its arms outstretched, its face twisted in a frozen scream. It was clawing its way upward, trying to break free. "No," I whispered, backing away from the edge of the lake. This isn't supposed to happen. But it was too late. The ritual hadn't worked. The spirit wasn't appeased. It was enraged, and now it was coming for me. The ice cracked again, louder this time, and I watched in horror as the frozen surface began to break apart, chunks of ice splintering off and sinking into the dark water below. The figure beneath the ice surged upward, and I turned and ran, my boots slipping on the snow-covered ground as I raced back toward the cabin. The whispers followed me, growing louder and more chaotic with every step, until it felt as though they were inside my head, screaming at me. I stumbled through the snow, the cabin barely visible through the swirling storm, and threw myself through the door, slamming it shut behind me. I collapsed against the door, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers had stopped, but the air inside the cabin felt thick with something dark and malevolent. I could feel it pressing in on me, waiting. The ritual had failed, and now I had to face the consequences. I sat by the door, trembling, trying to catch my breath. The whispers had subsided, but the air inside the cabin felt suffocating, as if the very walls were closing in around me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The ritual was supposed to work, at least that's what my grandfather had believed. But instead of calming the spirit, I had unleashed something far worse. I had no idea what to do next. The spirit was out there now, more restless and angry than ever. I could feel its presence, lurking just beyond the walls, waiting for me to make the next move. The thought of facing it again sent a chill down my spine. A loud knock at the door startled me from my thoughts. My heart leapt into my throat as I scrambled to my feet, the knife still clutched in my hand. For a moment, I hesitated, wondering if the spirit had somehow taken on a physical form. But then I heard a familiar voice from the other side of the door. "It's Harris," the old man called out. "Let me in, boy." Relief flooded through me, and I quickly unlocked the door, pulling it open. Old man Harris stood there, bundled up against the snow, his face etched with concern. He stepped inside quickly, shutting the door behind him. "I thought you might have tried something stupid," Harris muttered, shaking the snow from his coat. "And it looks like I was right. I tried the ritual," I stammered, my voice shaky. "But it didn't work. It made things worse." Harris shot me a sharp look, his eyes narrowing. "What exactly did you do, boy?" I explained everything as quickly as I could. How I had followed the instructions in my grandfather's journal. How I had offered the locket and the blood as part of the ritual. How the spirit had begun to rise from beneath the ice. Harris listened in silence, his expression growing darker with every word. When I finished, Harris let out a long, heavy sigh and shook his head. "I warned you, didn't I? I told you not to mess with this." "I had to try," I said, feeling a surge of defensiveness. "I couldn't just leave it alone. The whispers, they're driving me mad." Harris walked over to the window and stared out at the lake, his hands clasped behind his back. For a long moment, he said nothing, and I could feel the tension in the room thickening with each passing second. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and cold. "There's something I didn't tell you before." I frowned, unsure of what he meant. "What are you talking about?" Harris turned to face me, his eyes hard. "Your grandfather didn't just fail at the ritual. He was never meant to succeed. I was the one who convinced him to try it. I needed him to fail." A chill shot through me. "What? Why?" Harris took a step toward me, his gaze unflinching. "The spirit, the thing beneath the ice, it wasn't always there. It was drawn to the lake, summoned by the ritual your grandfather and I performed years ago. We thought we could control it, but we were wrong. And now it's been trapped here ever since, waiting." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. "You used my grandfather? You knew the ritual wouldn't work." "I needed him to act as a conduit," Harris said, his voice cold and matter-of-fact. "And now you're here. You've completed the circle, boy. The spirit isn't just looking for peace. It's looking for release. And you're going to help me give it what it wants." My blood ran cold as Harris's words sank in. "You're insane," I whispered, taking a step back. "I'm not doing this. I'm not." But before I could finish, Harris lunged at me, knocking the knife from my hand. I stumbled back, crashing into the wall, my heart racing as Harris pinned me against the rough wood. "Don't you see?" Harris hissed, his eyes wild with desperation. "This thing is never going to leave unless we give it what it wants. We have to finish the ritual. Blood for blood." I struggled against him, but Harris was surprisingly strong for his age. Panic surged through me as I realized just how far he was willing to go. "Harris, stop!" I shouted, trying to free myself from his grip. "We don't have to do this." But Harris wasn't listening. He grabbed the knife from the floor, his hands shaking as he brought it up between us. "It's too late," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "It's already begun." I fought harder, my mind racing for a way out, and with a desperate surge of strength, I pushed Harris back. He stumbled, and I seized the opportunity, grabbing a nearby chair and swinging it at him with all my might. The chair connected with a sickening thud, and Harris crumpled to the floor, unconscious. I stood there for a moment, breathing hard, staring down at the old man. My hands were shaking, my mind reeling from what had just happened. I hadn't wanted it to come to this, but I had no choice. I had to stop Harris before he dragged me down with him. The silence after Harris collapsed was almost as suffocating as the tension that had filled the room moments before. My pulse pounded in my ears, and the only sound was my own ragged breathing. Harris lay motionless on the floor, the knife still clutched in his hand, its blade gleaming in the low light of the cabin. For a brief moment, I stood frozen, my mind reeling. I hadn't meant for it to come to this, but I had no choice. Harris had lost his grip on reality, and his obsession with the spirit beneath the ice had driven him to madness. He'd wanted to use me, just as he had used my grandfather, and I couldn't let that happen. But now what? The ritual had failed. The spirit was still out there, and Harris's betrayal had shattered any hope I had of understanding what I needed to do. The snowstorm outside had intensified, and the cabin felt more isolated than ever, as if the world had closed in on me, trapping me in this nightmare. I had to act. I grabbed my coat, threw it on, and hurried outside into the storm. The wind howled through the trees, and snow pelted my face as I made my way back to the lake. My heart pounded in my chest, and every step felt heavier, as though the weight of the spirit's presence was pressing down on me, slowing my movements. The ice groaned beneath my boots as I approached the center of the lake, where the cracks were widest, and the dark shape beneath the surface was most visible. The whispers returned, louder now, more insistent, swirling around me like the wind itself. They were pulling me closer, urging me to finish what had been started. I stopped just before the edge of the largest crack, staring down at the dark water below. The figure beneath the ice was moving again, its hands clawing at the surface, trying to break free. Its face was still frozen in that terrible scream, but its eyes were open now, wide and staring, locked onto me with a hunger that sent a shiver down my spine. I knew what I had to do. With trembling hands, I pulled the silver locket from my pocket, the one that had belonged to my grandfather. It was cold and heavy in my hand, and I could feel the weight of the past pressing down on me, the mistakes that had been made, the unfinished business that still lingered here. "Take it," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the storm. "Take this and let it end." I held the locket over the crack in the ice, my breath hanging in the cold air as I prepared to drop it into the dark water below. The whispers grew louder, more desperate, swirling around me in a cacophony of voices. But something was wrong. The spirit's hunger hadn't been sated. I could feel its presence growing stronger, more menacing, as though the offering wasn't enough. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. It didn't want the locket. It wanted blood, my blood. A surge of panic shot through me, and I stumbled back, my feet slipping on the ice. But before I could move further, the ground beneath me began to crack. The ice splintered under my weight, sending jagged lines radiating outward. My heart raced as the surface gave way, and I plunged into the freezing water below. The cold hit me like 1,000 knives, cutting through my skin and numbing my body almost instantly. The water was dark and murky, and I struggled to keep my head above the surface, gasping for breath. But the ice was already closing in above me, sealing me inside the lake's frozen tomb. The spirit was there with me, its presence enveloping me like a shroud. I could feel its hands reaching for me, pulling me down into the depths, its cold fingers wrapping around my arms and legs. The whispers were deafening now, filling my mind with a desperate need, a hunger that threatened to consume me. I fought with every ounce of strength I had left, kicking and thrashing against the icy grip of the spirit. But it was too strong and the water too cold. My limbs grew heavy, my vision blurred, and a deep sense of dread settled over me as I realized that I might not make it out alive. But I couldn't give up, not yet. With one final surge of willpower, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the knife. The blade was cold and slick with water, but I gripped it tightly and swung it at the spirit's hands, slashing through the darkness that surrounded me. The effect was immediate. The spirit recoiled, its grip loosening, and I seized the opportunity to push myself upward, breaking through the ice just as my lungs burned for air. I gasped, coughing and spluttering as I dragged myself onto the surface, my body shivering uncontrollably from the cold. The lake was silent now. The whispers had stopped, and the figure beneath the ice was gone, swallowed by the darkness below. The ritual had failed, but somehow I had survived. I lay there on the ice for what felt like an eternity, staring up at the swirling snow above me, my mind numb from exhaustion and fear. The storm raged on, but the lake was calm once more. The spirit had receded for now, but I knew it wasn't over. The lake still held its secrets, and the spirit was still waiting, biding its time. I had escaped its grasp this time, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it would return, hungrier than ever. And when it did, I would be ready. I lay there on the ice for several moments, my body trembling from the cold and the terror of what had just happened. Every breath felt like a jagged edge slicing through my lungs, but I was alive. The snow swirled above me, the sky a heavy gray blanket that seemed to press down against my chest, reminding me that this nightmare was far from over. I forced myself to sit up, my muscles aching from the freezing water and the strain of fighting the spirit's grip. The lake was eerily still now, the cracks in the ice frozen in place like scars. The dark shape that had haunted me for days was gone, but I knew better than to believe it was over. The lake had taken something from me, my peace, my sense of safety, and it wasn't done yet. I dragged myself to my feet, the wind biting into my skin as I stumbled back toward the shore. Every step felt like an eternity, my body heavy with exhaustion and the weight of the spirit's presence still clinging to me. But I kept moving, knowing that stopping meant succumbing to the cold, to the whispers, to the thing that still lurked beneath the ice. When I reached the cabin, I collapsed against the door, pushing it open with what little strength I had left. The warmth of the fire hit me like a wave, and I crawled inside, slamming the door shut behind me. I leaned against it, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I tried to steady myself. For a moment, I simply sat there, listening to the crackling of the fire and the howl of the wind outside. The whispers were gone, at least for now, but their echo lingered in the corners of my mind, reminding me that the lake wasn't finished with me yet. But I had survived. Somehow, I had managed to break free from the spirit's grasp, to pull myself out of the icy depths that had nearly claimed me. The weight of that victory settled over me like a heavy blanket, and I realized, with a shudder, that the only way to truly overcome this was to leave. The lake would not let me rest until I was far from its reach. The days after the confrontation passed in a blur. I packed up what little I had brought with me to the lake house, my hands still shaking from the memories of what had transpired. The cabin that had once felt like a refuge now seemed like a prison, haunted by the specter of the spirit that lingered just beyond the frozen lake. I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. Whatever connection my grandfather had to the lake, whatever unfinished business lay beneath its surface, it wasn't mine to resolve. The whispers had quieted, but I could feel them still, waiting. They would never truly leave, not as long as the spirit remained trapped beneath the ice, bound by the ritual that had gone so horribly wrong. As I loaded the last of my things into the car, I took one final look at the lake. The surface was calm, almost serene, the cracks in the ice covered now by a fresh layer of snow. It would have been beautiful under different circumstances, but I knew better. The lake's stillness was only a mask, hiding the restless spirit that lurked below. I had survived, but only barely. I had learned that some things were not meant to be understood, that some truths should remain buried in the depths of the past. My grandfather had made his choices, and I had nearly paid the price for them. I started the car, the engine rumbling to life beneath me, and drove away from the lake house without looking back. The road twisted and turned through the thick woods, the snow falling lightly on the windshield. The tension in my chest began to ease the farther I got from the lake, though I knew it would never truly leave me. As I reached the main road, my phone buzzed in the passenger seat. I picked it up, glancing at the screen. It was an unknown number, but something about it made my heart skip a beat. Hesitating for a moment, I answered. "Hello," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. On the other end, there was silence, and then, faintly, a familiar sound. The whispering, distant but unmistakable, drifting through the line. The lake would never let me go.
If you enjoyed unraveling this, you're in for another spine-tingling tale. Click the video on your screen to discover more eerie stories from the Phantom Story Society, where history's darkest secrets come to life. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Until next time, stay curious and beware of the shadows.